Hello and welcome to another episode of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. My name is Melissa Whitecross and I'm coming to you live from a very wet Johannesburg, South Africa. We are grateful for the rains in South Africa as always, and long may they last. Now tonight is our 40th episode for 2021 series of Conservation Conversations. Can you believe it? It also marks our 74th episode overall. What a journey it's been, and a massive thank you to each and every one of you who have been a part of it. We welcome back the incredible ornithological legend himself, David Allan, to your screens tonight with another enthralling tale about KZN's pelagic birds. For those of you who are new to birding, that's when you go out to see some of the incredible birds that have adapted to our oceans. But before we get into tonight's webinar, please remember that you can communicate with us using the Zoom chat room, and questions for our speaker can be posted into the Q&A box throughout the webinar on Zoom. And if you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can use the comment feed for your comments and questions. David will answer these at the end of the webinar. Now you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to get in touch with us on all major social media channels and catch up on all of our previous episodes via BirdLife South Africa's YouTube channel. So many of you have generously contributed to keep these webinars free for all to learn and enjoy. Every little bit helps, and we really do appreciate your support. We're also really excited to have the return of our donations drive competition, thanks to the generous support of Peter Ginn. And we'd like to reward one lucky viewer who donates towards the show over the remainder of October and November with a copy of the Ultimate Companion for Southern African Birding. Simply scan the Quicket QR code on screen or visit our Conservation Conversations website to find the link to the donations tab, where all you have to do is donate 100 Rand or more. And for every 100 Rand that you do donate, we will give you an entry into the lucky draw. Thank you to those of you who have already booked your spot in our draw through your donations in the previous week. And please remember that this competition is unfortunately only open to our South African-based viewers. Now, BirdLife South Africa's 37th Birding Big Day, or BBD as it's known to some of us, will be taking place on Saturday, 27 November 2021. If you're keen to join in the fun, make sure to head over to the Birding Big Day webpage, which can be found by selecting the Events tab on our main website. Whether you're going midnight to midnight or trying to break records, or merely using the event as an excuse to round up some friends and enjoy a birding outing, make sure to register by filling in the online form on our website. This year, we are also very lucky to have a special lucky draw prize of a pair of Swarovski optic binoculars. To be eligible for this, your team must register and pay the 300 Rand donation for participation, which includes your official event cloth badges. All details can be found on our website. Now, lastly, don't miss out on the International Ornithological Congress taking place in Durban in August 2022. You can register at the IOC website, which is on screen, and the IOC is partnering with South Africa's University of KwaZulu-Natal, and there will be over 40 symposia on an extensive range of topics. So if you would like to be updated on the latest ornithological research from around the world, join birding excursions with BirdLife South Africa's top community bird guides. Make sure to block off 14 to 20 August 2022 and register now. If you are an ornithologist, note that submissions for the conference are open, but the abstract submissions will close on 1 December 2021. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome David Allan back to the show. Those of you who missed David's earlier webinar this year on the coordinated bird counts in the Durban Bay Harbour should definitely catch up on that fantastic talk on our YouTube channel. David's ornithological career began with a 7-year stint with a provincial government conservation agency, where he worked on birds of prey, threatened high-felt grassland birds, and water birds. He then moved to the University of Cape Town, where he studied cranes and bustards, and then onto the Avian Demography Unit, where he worked primarily on the Southern African Bird Atlas project. David took up a position as Curator of Birds at the Durban Natural Science Museum in 1996, the same time BirdLife South Africa was established, funny enough, and recently retired from this position in September 2021. David is a long-time member of BirdLife South Africa and its predecessor, the Southern African Ornithological Society, and has served in numerous capacities for the organization at both the national and local levels. Earlier this year, he was awarded the prestigious Gill Memorial Medal, BirdLife South Africa's highest award, and he is a thoroughly worthy recipient of this award, I might add. David's list of publications numbers over 700, and he is an author or co-author of 5 books. 3 of these are on birds of prey, 1 on cranes, and 1 on geographical variation in birds. He was one of the 7 editors of the 2-volume The Atlas of Southern African Birds. He's also a regular contributor to BirdLife South Africa's magazine, African BirdLife. David, it's a privilege to have you back on the show to share more of your incredible knowledge of KZN's birds with us. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us tonight. And I'm going to hand over to you to share your screen and take us through your amazing talk.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you.
And as Bonita says, a privilege to meet you here. Thanks so much for coming on the show, David.
Okay, I think there we are. Hopefully that's showing up nicely now. Is that it?
Over to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Melissa. Yes, well, I started at the museum 25 years ago, at the same time as BirdLife South Africa got started. But I mean, I've retired now, but BirdLife South Africa certainly isn't retiring and is going from strength to strength, which is wonderful to see. Thank you, everybody, for joining me this evening to talk about the pelagic seabirds off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal. Over the years that I've been in Durban, I've managed to do over 100 pelagic seabirds off the coast, seabird trips off the coast. As my colleagues will tell you, I've tried to get on every single trip I could in that period and take people out, but I've kind of stepped down a bit from it in the last couple of years. But the content of this talk this evening is just to review the status of the pelagic seabirds off the coast, particularly looking at the species involved, what time of year each species comes off our coast, where they show patterns of seasonality, and then to have a look at the abundance of these birds, of each of these species. In particular, any evidence of perhaps an increasing or decreasing over time that might have relevance to climate change related effects or other conservation related phenomena. So that's the gist of it. And I've tried to get information from every possible source on the seabirds of KwaZulu off the coast. So with that introduction, let's move on. Well, let me just kick off by saying that there's several people that I've collaborated with, both looking at the seabirds themselves and gathering information on them. In particular, Neil Perrins and Richard Everett, who joined me on doing pelagic trips from about 2012 onwards, and really brought tremendous energy to those trips. And we shared almost a decade of going off Durban on many, many occasions. Very happy memories for me and hopefully for them as well. In an earlier period, Athol Marchant did many pelagics off Durban during the period 1983 to 2008. And Athol very kindly shared all the information from his pelagic seabird trips to add to this review, to give it a deeper historical depth to the review. Andrew Sutherland was based at Richards Bay, and he ran pelagics off there, and similarly gave me all his information covering the period 2002 to 2007, which really has enriched things. Dieter Ushadlius provided all information on birds ringed on the coast of KwaZulu, or pelagic seabirds ringed on the coast of KwaZulu-Natal, either birds that were brought into rehab centers because they were injured and then were ringed before they were released, or they were birds that were found with rings already on them in our region. And then lastly, Trevor Hardacre and Digby Cyrus, who keep spreadsheets of rarity records in KwaZulu-Natal, also provided information for the review. Okay, so probably the primary source of information has been from these one-day pelagic trips that go out mainly from Durban, but as I said, some from Richards Bay and even a few from off St. Lucia, Isimangaliso Park. And this graph just shows the number of these pelagic trips that I was able to get information for over the whole long period, for every month of the year. And you can see it's highly biased towards the winter, early summer period. I've got information of 2007 pelagic trips off the coast of KZN. Starting in 1974 was the first one, and the review period ended in 2018. And you see there we got a peak of trips in August, which is when most of these birds, which are winter visitors, are at their peak off our shore, and much lower numbers in the early, especially going into the late summer, which is a little unfortunate. So it's not a very even sampling period, if you like. We've got good information for the winter, and the information from summers is there, but it's a bit more ropey. The trips go off in commercial recreational fishing boats like this one here that we've used off Durban on many, many occasions. It takes up to about a dozen birders on it, and they take us out to sea to look at to find our pelagic seabirds. They're quite comfortable ships to work from, and when the weather's bad, we've got cover there, so it works out well. And especially in the early years, I used to concentrate on looking for trawlers, which operate about 20 kilometers out of Durban, because you get a big concentration of scavenging seabirds at the back of the trawlers. Like here's one here. And what's happening is that as they're pulling fish up, some are escaping from the sides of the nets, floating to the surface, and also they're cleaning the fish and throwing the discards over. So there's plenty for these seabirds to scavenge from. And look a bit closer up, there's as the net comes in, all these birds, albatrosses and the larger petrels, are all trying to exploit the scavenging opportunities at the back of these trawlers. And it can be quite a melee there, with some of the bigger albatrosses really being bully boys and muscling their way in on the scraps, pushing the smaller birds out of the way. So it's all a bit of an aggressive and unruly setup, but quite a spectacle to see. Here's just one shot I took of an immature Indian yellow-nosed albatross at the back of a trawler that had snatched up this rather fascinating looking fish, but clearly he'd bitten off more than he can chew, because they're going to have no luck in being able to either pull that fish apart or be able to swallow it whole. And it's clearly only an immature bird that would be silly enough to do something like that, take a fish that big. But we had a change of method from about 2013 onwards. It was Neil's idea that we should try and keep away from the trawlers shortly after he started coming out. He said that we're more likely to find some of the smaller, rarer, and more interesting birds away from the trawlers, because these birds, smaller species, are afraid of these larger birds around the trawlers, and so they keep away from those rugby scrums. And we should do our chumming a bit further out, as far out to sea as we can go, and keep away from the trawlers. And coincidentally, at the same time, Hadaram Shiria, an Israeli biologist, came out to Durban on a couple of trips with us. He was looking for photographic opportunities, but he introduced us to a new and very efficient way of chumming to attract seabirds at sea, using floating blocks of chum. And that also hugely increased the success of our trips in terms of what we were seeing, in terms of new species and rarer species. So here's a shot of some great winged petrels that have been attracted to chum well away from trawlers. This is not a sight you would see close to a trawler, because a bird like the great winged petrel, it's not that large, and it keeps away from trawlers. It's not attracted to them. So if you want to see these slightly more unusual seabirds, you've got to move away. You've got to keep away from the trawlers. Okay, and boy, there's nothing like being on a pelagic trip, and as something interesting comes over the horizon and hoves closer to the boat, there's a palpable sense of excitement from everyone on board, as suddenly everyone's attention fixates on one point to try and see what they're next going to see that's exciting. And believe me, the pelagic seabird trip is probably your best chance of seeing a national rarity. That, and looking at an open intertidal flat with waders is your greatest chance of seeing a rarity, probably 10 times more than in normal, just typical normal land-based birding, because they're so mobile, these birds moving across the globe in the open ocean. And of course, the photographic opportunities are great as well. You know, these are big, spectacular birds, and they often occur in quite big numbers, and they come close to the boat. So you're getting the opportunity to get some really good photographs, which has become so critical to bird watching these days, and the enjoyment of birds, often done more through the lens of a camera these days than it is through your binoculars even. But of course, when the sea's rough, some people tend to get a little bit seasick, and it can be a bit miserable for maybe 1 in 10 people on the trip. And this is just one trip of 2 people who on a very rough day are having a very miserable day of it and spending quite a lot of time hanging over the back of the boat to make their own contribution to the chum. Okay, now other sources of information are not just from the pelagic trips, but also from newsletters and other literature and rarities reports in various formats, published and unpublished, that also provide information on these pelagic seabirds seen off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal as the Bird Club newsletter. Also museum specimens. For example, my museum has a very big collection of pelagic seabird specimens in its study skins. Often because these birds get beached and their carcasses are found on the beach, and people bring them to the museum and we prepare them and curate them. So for example, this fairy prion here comes from 1914, one of our very earliest specimens, a very rare bird anywhere off the coast of South Africa, and one of the very few specimens in a collection in South Africa. And then from the ringing results, also a good set of data there. You know, for example, here, this is an interesting one. We had this subantarctic skua on the way back from a trip coming in the mouth of Durban Harbour. And as it dropped down close to the water to pick up some sardines we were throwing off the back of the boat for it to pick up, it dropped its legs and showed these rings, a metal ring and a color ring. And using our cameras, we got such good photographs, we were able to read the ring combination and even the metal ring number. The bird was so close to us. And we were able to determine that the bird was ringed as a chick 5 years and 4 months previously, earlier at Marion Island, which is about 2,000 kilometers to the southeast. Marion Island, of course, being the destination for the flock at sea trip coming up in the early part of next year, which everyone will be much looking forward to see these birds. Okay, so, you know, when you get all this information together, you see that there are about 40 pelagic seabirds that occur off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal in varying levels of abundance. There's a list of them there on the left-hand side, but we can't go through that list, and I won't be mentioning the majority of those species in this talk. There's just too much to cover. But if you look at some of the numbers in that table at the top, it's a monthly breakdown. It just shows you the maximum number ever recorded on a pelagic trip of each species in each month. And, you know, the darker the blue shading, the larger the number. And it gives you some immediate idea of seasonality. So if you look there at Wilson Storm Petrel on the top row, you can see that it's recorded in every month of the year, but the highest numbers, up to 100 birds, recorded in the early winter, May to June. You come down to Indian yellow-nosed albatross, you see again recorded every month of the year, but your biggest numbers are from May through to about October, November, where you're getting hundreds of birds. We don't want to dwell too much on a dense table like this. Let's move on and just look at the seasonality of occurrence of these birds and the patterns you get in a few examples. So these are birds here that occur in the winter months. They do occur throughout the year though, but the winter is their key period of occurrence. And so if you look at the graph there, you can see the months of records showing that for both of these species, the mid to late winter into early spring are the key periods of occurrence, from June through to about September. But there are some records at other times of the year, presumably non-breeding birds that haven't gone back to their islands, because these species come from the southern oceans where they breed on islands like Marion Island. And then in the cold, dark winters down there, they push north to escape that, and we get them in winter off our coast before when summer returns, they go back to those islands to breed again. And these two species, the Indian yellow-nosed albatross and the white-chinned petrel, are the two commonest pelagic seabirds off Durban. You will not go off Durban and not see at least one of those two species. Here's just a better photograph of an Indian yellow-nosed albatross, a fully adult bird. Young birds have all black bills. But the adult bird's a very pretty albatross. It is the smallest of our albatrosses, but it's certainly the most attractively patterned. A very clear black and white plumage, black on the back, jet black on the back, and pure white on the underparts and on the head and neck. And then there's black, long, relatively thin bill in this species of albatross, with a distinctive yellow stripe along the top of the bill and a red tip to the bill. A very attractive looking bird. We very occasionally get Atlantic yellow-nosed albatrosses off Durban. There's a photograph of one of those on the left-hand side, and they're very similar to Indian yellow-nosed albatross. The two species were once considered to be subspecies of the same species, but they're now thought to be separate. The Atlantic has a grayer head and neck, but that's not quite as striking as those black mascara-like markings around the eyes, which are absent in the Indian yellow-nosed albatross. And when you get a really good look like this in a photograph head-on, the shape of the yellow stripe at the top of the bill is different in the two species. It's more rounded at the base of the yellow stripe there in the Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross, and it's more pointed in the Indian yellow-nosed albatross. That's a subtle but consistent difference between the two species. And here's a photograph of a white-chinned petrel, better than the one you saw with the graph above it. This is the commonest petrel off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal, sorry. A very big bird, all dark in appearance. This bird has a very, very small white chin there. You can barely see it. In actual fact, it's the bill that's very white in this species. The name's a bit of a misnomer, like with many bird common names. But the size of this bird's chin is very, very small, hardly noticeable at all. Just here underneath the base of the bill, there's your white chin. Some individuals have a far more pronounced white chin, like this individual here, which is where it's a far better developed marking. But the weirdest white-chinned petrel that we ever saw of Durban was this individual, in with a flock of several hundred of them behind a trawler. It's an albino. You can see that by the pale eye that it's got. The bill is white, but normal birds have some black markings along the edges of the bill. Those are absent in this individual. And of course, the plumage is completely white, with just some sort of slightly darker smudges on them. But essentially, it's a pure white bird. And as it took off, we could even see the color of the legs, which should have been, in a normal bird would have been completely black. The legs too, like the eye, were lacking in any pigment. So they were sort of pinkish in appearance. And you'll note also the very heavy wear in the wing feathers there as it took off, particularly in the tips of the primaries. And this is very typical of white plumage in birds, which is less resistant to wear. So it wears away a lot more quickly than a pigmented feather would. So a poor individual like this, an albino individual like this, has many disadvantages and probably not a very long lifespan out in the wild. Too conspicuous, too vulnerable in its eyesight, and then suffering from abnormally heavy feather wear. Okay, and then we have other species, smaller species that also come up from their breeding islands in the southern oceans to winter off our coast, but they tend to have a much more discrete period of occurrence in the winter, and there are long periods in summer where when they are never recorded off our region. So presumably all of them go back to those breeding islands during the summer months, unlike the white-chinned petrel and the yellow-nosed albatross, where a few individuals can be found in our waters throughout the winter. So if you look at pintado petrel there, all records are between May and November, and there has never been a record of a pintado petrel between December and April. And it's the same with the Antarctic prion. You can see there concentration of records in winter, and the midsummer period, there are no records at all. So a much more discrete seasonality to those two species. Okay, then by contrast, here's a completely different group of seabirds that come off our coast. And they're coming from the North Atlantic Ocean on the other end of the planet, up in the Northern Hemisphere. And they come down as summer migrants to our region, summer non-breeding migrants from their breeding grounds in the Northern Hemisphere, when they are breeding during our winter, which is, of course, the Northern summer. And two examples there are Cory shearwater and European storm petrel, both fairly regularly recorded off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal. And those graphs there with their records for each month and the various sources where those records come from, pelagics, literature, specimens, ringing. You can see that as summer migrants, they're arriving about November, same as things like barn swallows. and then staying quite surprisingly late. Both species, you're getting a lot of records as late as May, and even in the case of Kori shearwater, substantial numbers even into June, and even an occasional record at the wrong time of year in winter. Those must be birds that are just maybe moving very, very late or not bothering to go back. Okay, and then come to a third group of seabirds visiting KZN from a third and separate, different location. These birds are coming from the tropical Indian Ocean. They're coming from tropical islands in the Indian Ocean, like Reunion Island, Amsterdam, Reunion, Mauritius, those sort of islands there up towards Seychelles, places like that. They tend to come, if you look here, as two examples, the tropical shearwater and the sooty tern. And note that the peak period of occurrence of these species is in late summer. And both of them show quite a marked peak on February. And that, of course, is the peak month of cyclone activity in the Indian Ocean. So when you get these heavy cyclones, and we had one a couple of years ago here off KwaZulu, off the east coast of Africa, we had a lot of sooty terns pushed inland all over South Africa. And that's that time of year, that is when that happens. They're being pushed into our waters in the back of they're trying to get away from the strong winds of these cyclones. And if you note with the sooty tern there, look at where most of the records come from in February. They come from specimens. So these are dead and dying birds that have been brought into museums, particularly my museum, also the Ditsong Museum in Pretoria, where they end up in museum collections because they're either found dead or they die soon after from exhaustion. And that reflects the cyclone-driven nature of their occurrence. Although with a sooty tern, you do get occasional individuals throughout the year. For example, I know some were seen this past weekend on the two pelagics off, at least one of the two pelagics off Durban that Neil was leading. Okay, so that's the third group. So here's just a map of the world to just show the three different areas of the world where we get groups of seabirds coming from: the North Atlantic in the Northern Hemisphere, the tropical Indian Ocean, Madagascar and the islands surrounding it, and then the Southern Ocean and the islands down there towards the South Pole. So we're really on the crossroads of it's an exciting concept of being linked to these far-flung and exotic and romantic type of localities. Okay, and now let's just turn our attention to look and see how some of this review information can be used to try and look for changes in abundance of these species off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal over time. And to do that, I used the information from the pelagic seabird trips, the one-day pelagic seabird trips, over 200 of them in the sample, starting from 1974, going through all the way to 2018. And I chopped the information up into 4 different time periods that roughly correspond with 4 different decades, essentially. So starting in 74 to 89, then from 1990 to 1999, 2000 to 2009, and 2010 to 2018. And then you can look at the percentage of pelagic trips on which the species was recorded for each one of those 4 time periods, to look and see if there's any change in their relative abundance from the pelagics over those 4 time periods. And so here's some examples. I'm going to show you some examples of where you can see some very clear-cut changes. And one of them here, this is the wandering albatross. You know, in the early period, the 70s and the 80s, wandering albatrosses were seen off KwaZulu-Natal coast on just over 10% of pelagic trips. So in 1 in 10 trips, you'd have a good chance of seeing one. But that's dropped dramatically over the following 3 decades, down to less than 2% or just over 2%, suggesting quite a substantial decreasing occurrence of wandering albatross in our waters. Even more clear-cut, and this was something that had not been suspected before until we put all this information together for this review, was a very clear-cut change in abundance of the prettiest little seabird, pelagic seabird we get off our coast, the pintado petrel, beautiful little black and white seabird. I mentioned it under seasonality a little bit earlier, showing the concise winter period of occurrence. And you note here that in the 70s and the 80s and through to the 90s, pintado petrels are recorded on 60 to, over 50 to over 60% of pelagic seabird trips. So the bird was regularly recorded, and more often than not on an offshore pelagic seabird trip. But over the last 2 decades, that has dropped dramatically to less than 30%, 2000 to 2009, and dropping even further from 2010 to 2018. And drilling further into that sort of decrease, the early pelagics used to see 20, 30, 40 pintado petrels together when they went on their trips on some occasions. Whereas these days you will only ever see single birds, or at best maybe 2 or 3. No, really, I don't think we've ever seen 3 on a trip in the last 20 years or so. Sorry, it keeps jumping like that. I'm not sure. I've got some timing thing on by mistake. A bit late to try and fix it now. So we'll just have to work with it. So anyway, the pintado petrel, there's no doubt, much less common bird off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal than it used to be. Let's have a look at the southern and northern giant petrels, which show an interesting contrasting patterns of occurrence off KZN. The southern giant petrel, which is present on all 4 of those time periods there, you can see it showing a fairly clear pattern of decrease. You know, in the early period occurring in nearly 30% of pelagic trips, most recently dropping down to less than 10% of pelagic trips. But then very surprisingly, suddenly in the last decade, we suddenly started seeing northern giant petrels regularly, and in fact more frequently than we're seeing southern giant petrels. It's as if the one species is replacing the other. And it will be interesting going forward. I may not be around to see it, don't know how many more decades I've got ahead of me, to see whether this pattern actually accentuates with the one species replacing the other. I recently was looking at the Mouse-Free Marion project website. This, of course, is probably the most challenging conservation project that BirdLife South Africa and its partners are launching. It's the biggest conservation challenge the organization's probably ever faced, will be trying to get rid of mice from Marion Island. And I would, ask everybody who's listening to this talk who's got any interest in pelagic seabirds to please get themselves knowledgeable about this project and try to assist it in any way they possibly can. It's got its own website. So please, put your shoulder to the wheel. This is the time where something of great significance could be achieved. Anyway, one of the stories they showed was how a northern giant petrel on Marion Island had been attacked by these mice that are attacking the seabirds on these islands and killing their chicks and actually damaging some of the adults as well, and had inflicted this wound on the side of this incubating northern giant petrel. So while it's sitting on the eggs there at night, the mice came out, the mice come out, and then they gnaw away at the flesh of the seabirds. And it suddenly struck me that a few years ago, while we were out, we had seen a northern giant petrel off Durban that had this interesting, well, horrible looking wound at the elbow of its leg here. I hope you can see it there, circled in red on the leg. And here's another photograph of the same wound from a different angle on that bird. And I couldn't help but feel that, I wonder if that possibly wasn't damage from mice. If it had come up from Marion Island, perhaps this is an injury caused in the same way as the one that was noted on the bird on the nest. But of course, there's no way of knowing for sure. But anyway, it's a possibility. Okay, let's move away from the bad news that we've been dwelling on there for a moment and look at some good news. Look at the pattern of the flesh-footed shearwater, a bird that you've got a better chance of seeing off Durban than in pelagics off anywhere else in southern Africa, which shows a clear pattern of occurrence. In the 70s and 80s, flesh-footed shearwaters are being recorded on only 20 to 30% of pelagic seabird trips, whereas these days it's between 50 and 60%. You're in with a very good chance. In fact, you're likely to see them off Durban. And in fact, on one memorable occasion, we had almost 200 birds at the back of a trawler off Durban about a decade or so ago. So a species that's showing a clear pattern of increase of abundance off the coast of KZN. I don't know why. One just records these things, what's actually driving them. One would need a much bigger, fuller picture of the species status globally to drill into. Okay, I'd like to just move on to look at how our change in our way of doing our pelagic trips has affected the assessment of change over time. the new improved chumming technique, the keeping away from trawlers, using chum further out away from trawlers to attract the smaller species, has actually quite biased these changes, attempts to try and see change in abundance over time. And we look at the storm petrels. These are some Wilson storm petrels attracted to chum. They're a species that really loves to come when you have chum in the water, and they're quite hard to see at other times. They're small and otherwise widely dispersed in the ocean and very easily overlooked. And if we look at the graphs of the 4 storm petrels you get off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal, looking at the data from the pelagic trips, all 4 of them show their highest numbers, often quite markedly, during the last decade. And that reflects the efficiency of the chumming method that we're using in attracting these birds to the boats. So Wilson storm petrel jumped from, 30 to 40% of trips, up to now we're seeing them 70 to 80% of trips. So virtually always seeing them using the new chum. Same with European storm petrel increase. Black belly storm petrel, suddenly a big jump in records as well. And we've had the only records ever of white-faced storm petrel in the last decade off KwaZulu-Natal. 2 of those came from chumming and 1 didn't. It doesn't quite fit the pattern. And the same applies to these very pretty little seabirds, the prions. Similarly, quite small. They love to come to chum when you have it in the water. They're small, like the storm petrels, so they tend to keep away from the trawlers where the big bully boys threaten them. They stay away in the open ocean. And we look at the graph of them. Again, you'll see that in the last decade, we're getting higher numbers than in the previous 3 time periods. In fact, prior to this decade, there was a pattern there of decreasing abundance of Antarctic prion from pelagic seabird trips, and it suddenly jumped up there with our new techniques. So, this data is all very unreliable when it comes to the prions and the storm petrels. We can't draw any conclusions based on the data from the pelagic trips because of the confounding effect of changing our techniques. Okay, let's have a look at the pterodroma petrels, a couple of pterodromas that we get, the gadfly petrels. These are perhaps the most spectacular flying birds that you can see under high wind conditions in the open ocean. They really are spectacular. The commonest of them off Durban is the great winged petrel. They're on the left-hand side. And again, it's a species strongly attracted to chum, keeps away from the trawlers. We've had a huge jump in the frequency with which we're seeing it with the new chumming technique. Bird recorded on only up to about 20% of trips for the 3 decades before the present, up to now 70% of trips, we're getting great winged petrels. Soft plumage petrel, though, bucks the trend there and shows a decrease, the lowest in the last decade. And that seems strange because it is a species also that does seem to come to chumming. I want to just look at that in a little more detail, comparing it with Barrow's petrel here. The 2 species are very similar. If you look at the photographs there of the 2 of them in contrast, the big difference is the soft plumage petrel has an all dark underwing. So largely a pale underwing in Barrow's petrel. Soft plumage petrel is coming from the southern oceans where it breeds on those islands down south. It's a cold water bird, in other words. Barrow's petrel, by contrast, is one of those tropical summer visitors coming to us from Reunion Island in the tropical Indian Ocean, where it's a breeding species. And you'll see it's only appeared off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal over the last decade, with Andrew Sutherland getting the first records off Richards Bay, and then we started getting them quite regularly off Durban. And one can't help but note 2 things. Firstly, that possibly with climate change and the globe warming, perhaps warmer waters in our region are more regularly and for longer periods present, and that's bringing in a tropical species into what was previously an area dominated by cold water birds. That might explain why this change is occurring. Or is it possible that people were just in the earlier time periods overlooking Barrow's petrels amongst soft plumage petrels and just assuming that everything they were looking at was a soft plumage petrel? But it's hard to believe that because the underwing pattern is so distinctively different. It's hard to imagine that there was misidentification going on. Turn to look a little bit more at Barrow's petrel here, a scientific paper that came out that tells us something quite interesting about them, relevant to their occurrence off Durban. This is a map of birds that have been marked with geolocators, which can track where they go. It's a tracking device. And you see there the yellow star in that diagram, which is on the island of Reunion, just to the east of Madagascar. That's the breeding island. And then when they finish breeding at the end of summer, the blue lines, the red lines, sorry, show how they then move off to their wintering area, which in the middle of winter, they go to the central Indian Ocean. Those green areas there, the green coloration is their wintering area. And then blue is the line they take when they return to Reunion Island to breed again. So in all that movement, you see very little evidence of them coming anywhere near the coast of KwaZulu-Natal. But it just gets just a little bit more complicated. Because if we look at the next map here, showing you, look at the top map there, we're looking at Reunion Island again. When they arrive back ready to breed in September, the male and female get together at their breeding burrows, re-establish their pair bond, and then just before they lay eggs, which will happen in about November, both the males and females then leave the island for a short, relatively short period, a couple of months, to just feed up and pack on as much fat as possible before they're restricted to foraging directly around the island while they've got eggs and chicks. And the females go just off the east coast of Madagascar, but note where the males go, male Barrow's petrels, during the period September-November in these geo-tracked birds. They are the ones that come right here off the coast of Durban. Let me just show you the arrow here. There we go. So these are the birds we are seeing off Durban in very much our peak 2 months, October, November. These are the males just before incubation is about to start that they will share. And that's why we're seeing them at that time period. Okay, and then during actual incubation and chick rearing, again, they do disperse a bit from the island, but rarely as far as all the way to the east coast of KZN. It's this period here, September, November, when we're getting our male Barrow's petrels. Okay, so if I can just finish this talk off with just mentioning a few of the really mouth-watering rarities, the ones that have really stuck in my mind and those who've come out with me and on the trips I've done off Durban, particularly Neil and Rich, when this bird suddenly hove into sight on one day, quite late on a pelagic trip, we were on our way back to Durban, the roar that Richard Everett let out when this bird flew into sight scared the living bejesus out of all of us on that boat. I'll remember it to this day. It was a juvenile sooty albatross. I think it's only the third record ever off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal, and the other records have all been individuals that have been found dead or beached after storms. This is the first free-flying bird, I think, seen by birders off our coast. And essentially, the sooty albatross is not a bird you can see off the coast of Southern Africa on one-day pelagic trips. So we were very lucky to see that bird. It was in June 2016. A bird we've had 3 times with the new chumming technique is grey petrel. And everyone will tell you, including the many trips that go off the Cape, that grey petrel is another bird that just simply is never seen on one-day pelagic trips off the coast of South Africa. But we've had it 3 times off Durban, and I'm sure there are more still to come. Fantastic bird to see. Slender-billed prion, always a hugely, the prions are very difficult to identify at sea or at any other time. And we had this individual in June 2014, gave us very close up and very good views of it, allowed us to get some good photographs to see that very thin, straight-edged bill. There's no thickening at the base of the bill whatsoever. And then this gigantic white eyebrow that flares at the back and quite rounded wings as well. It had a different flight action to it and wing shape. Another great bird to have had off Durban. And then white-faced storm petrel. I think I mentioned it earlier when to do with chumming. The first one, Neil picked up while we were still on the way out to the chumming grounds and got a distant photograph of it. and that was in May 2014. In June 2016, we were sitting watching the chum with sort of 70 or 80 white Wilson storm petrels churning around, and suddenly in came a white-faced storm petrel. Stuck around for maybe 10 minutes or so. We got some good photographs of it. Again, a really rare bird to see off the coast of South Africa, off pelagics, essentially unknown. But what was really amazing was about an hour later, we thought the same bird came back again. But we photographed that, and then later on, comparing the photographs, you could see that it was actually a different individual. If you look at the pattern of wear in the tail there, and if you look at the bird on the left, it's still got some molt in the outer wings on the go, and different feather pattern on the just above the bill there. But this was a second individual. So with only 3 records of the species ever in KwaZulu-Natal, 2 of them were seen at the same place at the same time. You know, what does that mean? What's going on? Are there more of them out there that we overlook because they're so small and difficult to see? You know, to see 2 on the same day, it would be like going to the Kruger Park and seeing 2 Egyptian vultures, you know, sort of 50 kilometers apart on the same day. But of course, the best of them was the Tahiti petrel that we had in November 2018. This was the first confirmed record for Africa. There's an overseas researcher who was working on trawlers off southern Mozambique, and he claimed to have seen Tahiti petrel on a couple of occasions from the trawler off in that region, southern Mozambique, back in the 1980s, but nobody believed him. And then suddenly we had this one bird off Durban. It came in, stuck around for maybe 10 minutes or so, did a couple of, well, not as long as that. Came in, did a couple of turns, but long enough to let us get a good view of it, compare it in size with the other seabirds there, and get a few photographs to confirm it, and off it went. And that confirms those early Mozambique records, which had no photographs to back them up. And this is, of course, now the first confirmed record for Africa. And as a birder, you don't get anything better than that. And that was kind of about just before my 100th trip, I think, off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal. And it was a great note for me to kind of wrap up my involvement in this fantastic birding environment where you see these terrific birds and you never know what the next excitement is when you're out there scanning the horizon. And on that note, let me just thank you all very much. Thank you.
David, that was phenomenal. Thank you so much. I think you once again highlighted the value of these long-term data sets where people have collected unbelievable data through the decades, and we can see these really impressive and often scary changes throughout history. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think once again highlighting the incredibly important role that the evolution of digital photography has played in expanding our knowledge of birds in South Africa. I think, as you said, many people bird through their cameras these days, not their binoculars. But thank you so much for that really, really insightful talk. I certainly learned a lot and thoroughly enjoyed it. But before we dive into a few questions, I'm just going to remind everybody that next week, Mark Anderson in the house talking about the BirdLife South Africa 25th anniversary. So please do join us for that one next week. It's going to be a fantastic showcase of the organization's achievements through the years. And certainly there will be some nods towards our seabird conservation program in that schedule. And there is also a post-webinar survey after tonight's webinar. Please do take 2 minutes just to fill that in and give us some feedback on tonight's talk as well as the show. We really do appreciate everyone's feedback in those webinars. But David, I think to kick us off, as you said, you've done over 100 pelagics, and I saw a few photos of slightly green seasick individuals. If anybody was interested in going out on a pelagic trip, what would be your suggestion to them in terms of how to deal with seasickness and sort of preventative measures they could take?
You know, Melissa, there's really only one answer to that question that's the responsible answer, and that is go and see your regular medical practitioner and get his advice. You know, I'm not a qualified doctor in any way, so everybody tells you a different story. That's their own story, but to go to your GP and see what he advises that would be best for you. He knows you better than anybody else.
Absolutely. I think that's a very wise question. Thank you, David. And
but certainly do that. If you haven't been out in a small boat before and you don't know if you get seasick or not, if you don't have to worry. But if you don't know, maybe go and get something from him just in case. And then you'll know after your first trip whether you need to worry about it going forward or not.
Absolutely. And they're not exactly the cheapest exercises, so you don't want to spend most of them wrapped around the side of the boat. So very sage advice there, David. Thank you. Although we won't complain if, as you say, people are adding towards the chum on the day. And speaking of chum, I see Mike Bridgeford has asked, and feel free to decline, but could you tell us a little bit more about this new method of chumming you keep referring to?
Well, previously what we were doing was, the problem with chumming is that you take chopped up fish remains and things and you throw them into the water. But the problem is that they sink almost immediately. And so they're out of reach of the birds, and the smell factor, because these birds have a strong sense of smell, is also lost quite quickly. So what Haderam does is he freezes blocks of ice with all the fish material in it. And then that block of ice will float on the surface of the water for up to 20 minutes or so, especially in winter when it's cold, and only slowly does the material come off into the water. So it gives you a longer period of the chum being available on the surface, which is where the birds can see it and smell it.
Fantastic. And certainly, as you said, that's made a huge difference to the types of species that you've seen. Now, I see Craig McFarlane has said, thanks so much for an interesting talk. Have you noticed an increase in pelagic species when there's a good sardine run off the KZN coast?
Not as such, and one always expects that to happen. But the sardines often run a lot closer in to the coast than we go. So all the action with sardines is when they come into shallow water, and then they're available to all those predators coming at them from above and below. And we go out into deeper water way beyond where the sardines are, and where the sardines sometimes run further out, but then they're also running deeper in the water. But certainly we have seen some fantastic times when gannets have been diving into sardine shoals. And then sometimes you get small numbers of white-chinned petrels and sooty shearwaters around such aggregations, but not anything particularly exciting. It's the gannet sighting is always fantastic to see them diving into the water, but otherwise, no.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. One of the most amazing spectacles I've ever seen was out in Algoa Bay, where we had a whole flock of gannets diving into the water. And the sound they make is something unlike anything I've ever heard. That straight into the water is just amazing to behold. But certainly encourage everybody to try and get out and watch those incredible gannets. Now, I see we've got Caroline Walter tuning in all the way from the Netherlands, and she's saying all of these birds are rarities for me. So David, would you mind just explaining a little bit more around the difference between a petrel and a prion, please?
All of these birds are procellariform seabirds, which means tube nose. They have this tubular structure on the nose for the secretion of the high salt levels they get living in the ocean. And they range in size from the wandering albatross, those giant great albatrosses are the biggest of the tube noses, all the way down to the storm petrels, which are the size of sparrows, essentially, also have the same structure. So they're all each other's closest relatives. The smallest of the storm petrels, then the prions are the next size up. They're about the size of doves. And then you get to birds like the petrels and the shearwaters, which are sort of medium-sized. They're sort of intermediate in size between the albatrosses and some of those smaller species like the prions. So they're all different subgroups within this one family of birds.
Amazing. And as you say, those tube noses, it's quite spectacular if you do get the chance to get close to these seabirds to see that structure on the bills. And is it true that they use those sort of glands within the bill structure to try and decant salt out of the salt water, and that allows them to get a bit of hydration?
Yeah, yes, I think the tube nose has something to do with that. And they also have this very strong sense of smell. So unlike most birds, they do use the sense of smell very strongly to find their food, and also apparently to find their breeding burrows and their breeding islands as well. They can use their sense of smell for location too.
absolutely fascinating to see what all these different birds have evolved to do. Now, I know in the terrestrial landscape, Dave, we've got a whole plethora of colorful birds. Out in the open oceans, though, we seem to be looking at colors of brown, black and white, and maybe the odd splash of yellow here and there, or even a tinge of pink. And Di Jago was asking, what is the benefit of having this very select number of colors and contrasts to play with over the more colorful terrestrial birds?
Yeah, you know, normally color has got something to do with signaling or camouflage. So you're either trying to make yourself be camouflaged by tamping down your colors, taking on the game birds have intricate patterns to try and mottle patterns to blend into the background. And there are all other species that are trying to make themselves spectacularly visual, particularly to attract mates. So I think out in the, these birds, the breeding systems of these birds are quite different. They're breeding in colonies closely packed together on islands. They're often the smaller ones fly in and out at night, and they're nesting in burrows. So maybe a lot of their communication is auditory. They do a lot of calling because between the male and the female, because they're nesting in burrows. So I think maybe they don't have these bright colors because they don't really spend much time displaying to each other. The basic biology of the birds is not related to a display thing. So fairly drab colored. Things that are paler underneath, though, and darker above, that's counter shading. They're less obvious then to predators. And so a lot of the smaller seabirds have got paler underparts, maybe to make them less obvious to some of the bigger seabirds that are only too keen to try and grab them and eat them.
Absolutely. And I see we've got Pamela Isdell, our honorary patron from BirdLife South Africa, tuned in this evening, and a big hello to you, Pamela. And she's asking, do any of these birds mate for life, or will they look for new mates annually?
Oh, I think they very much mate for life. I think this group of birds, where they've been marked and everything, yes, they will tend to mate for life. I think, breeding is quite challenging for them because one individual has to go off and forage up to thousands of kilometers away while the other one attends the nest. And the one at the nest has to wait for that mate to come back again. It can't leave. It's got to incubate the eggs or guard the young, waiting for the other one to come back. So they've got to know each other really well. And the more they want to have the same individual year after year so that they can coordinate that activity, because it's really important for them. There's a lot of trust involved. If you're a bird sitting for days and days, even weeks, waiting for your mate to come back, trusting that that mate will not let you down, will, if they survive, come back to the nest and take on their half of the job. So I think, yes, lifelong bonds in birds like this.
Definitely, and they certainly are long-lived birds. Correct me if I'm wrong, David, but there's that Laysan albatross Wisdom who has outlived the gentleman who put a ring on her, I think over 75 years ago or something. You can give us the exact number, but what an unbelievably long time for these birds to do their thing. And I believe she's still successfully breeding. Yeah,
and I think that's right. The guy who ringed her recently passed away. Yeah, quite a poignant story that. Yes, yes.
Long lived in these incredible bonds, something we can all aspire to, I'm sure. Well, David, I think we're pretty much at the end of our questions, but just I see we've got one more from George Ledeck asking whether the Flock to Marion cruise is definitely going ahead. George, and I'm sure many of you tuning in are waiting on tenterhooks for that confirmation. We are waiting on MSC and the South African government to confirm, but for all intents and purposes, we are preparing that it will go. So please do what you need to be on that cruise. We will confirm as soon as we have any confirmation from the South African government, but we do ask for everyone's patience with us. It is unfortunately beyond our control at this point, but we are preparing and moving forward as if it is going. So please do just hang in there with us, and I promise we will get you the information as soon as we can. But one more question from me, David. In all your many, many years out there at sea, what has been your favorite memory out on those boats?
I think the Tahiti petrel, I think, has got to be the best one. And probably the first time we saw Barrow's petrel as well. That was one we'd be hoping for. So those two are real highlights for me.
Unbelievable. And what special birds to encounter. David, all I can say is thank you so much. That was yet another phenomenal Conservation Conversations webinar from you. And I will certainly be knocking on your door to bring you back next year. And I hope that you are having an absolutely wonderful time in your retirement. And if you'd like to add any last comments before we close off, the floor is yours.
Melissa, I think just to say, the Flock at Sea trip, this is going to be an unbelievable opportunity for people to see all of these birds. Firstly, it's going to be a long trip all the way down to Marion Island where the birds will be concentrated breeding. So many of the species I've talked about will be seen on that trip. And so you're going to see, you'd have to probably do 20 pelagic trips off the coast of South Africa to be able to see the number of birds and the number of species that people are going to see on the Marion Island flock trip. And secondly, you're going to have all these experts on board to point the birds out and help you find them and identify them correctly. So the Flock at Sea trip is a chance in a lifetime for the average birder to really go from zero to hero when it comes to their pelagic seabird list and their knowledge of and experience of these fantastic birds. And, linked with that is this Mouse-Free Marion project. This is, as I said earlier, look, it's the most important bird conservation challenge that South Africa has ever faced. And if it can be done successfully, it will be a world beater. Millions of seabird lives will be saved if it's successful. And I would urge every BirdLife South Africa member to contribute money and all other support and get the message out there that this has got to be made to work. As I said, millions of seabird lives depend on success here, and disaster if it's not successful. So I'd like to leave that as my last 2 points to make this evening. Thanks, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I could not have said that better myself. And certainly, we encourage every single one of you. I have popped the website link in the chat feed for the Mouse-Free Marion project. Do go and check it out, offer your support to it. And thirdly, on your point about flock, David, you will get to rub shoulders with the South African birding community in a way that has never been done before. There's a confined space with 2,000 of South Africa's absolute bird fanatics, and it is one hell of a fun experience. Whether you're birding off the deck or having a drink at the bar, you get to meet some of the incredible personalities. We will both be on board, so you'll get to rub shoulders with us and many of the other amazing South African birding personalities out there. So if you haven't yet booked your spot, I think there are still a few spots left. And for all intents and purposes, it is going ahead. So make sure to block out your diary and get onto that boat. It is going to be phenomenal. If anything, the previous flocks that have gone out have certainly rewritten the history books, and I'm sure this trip is going to be no exception. So make sure to get your spots booked and support that Mouse-Free Marion project. David, thank you. Another fantastic night on Conservation Conversations. I really appreciate it. And to all of you who tuned in and stayed with us, thank you so much for yet another Tuesday night with us. We will be back for our 75th episode next week. And a massive thank you to all of you who have been there with us for every single one of those. And be sure to tune in next week. Keep your eyes on the skies, keep enjoying those birds, and I will see you back here, same time, same place, 7 o'clock every Tuesday. Good night, everybody, and keep safe.